Fridays are pretty cool, I guess. Didn't see that one coming, did you? But the last day of the work and school week doesn't need me to say it's awesome. It just is. I'm Carl Azus. We're diving a little deeper today into the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, often referred to as the Middle East conflict. When we produced this show, not much had changed from the day before. The two sides were still engaged in their worst violence in years, with the Israeli military launching more airstrikes in Palestinian-controlled areas and Palestinian militants firing more rockets into Israel. In several Israeli cities, there's been rioting and violence between Arab and Jewish citizens. One mayor says decades of coexistence between these two groups had been, quote, trampled. Flights into Israel have been canceled by several international airlines, and it looked like the Israeli military and Palestinian militants were both waiting for the other side to stop its attacks first before pulling back on their own. Gaza is the Palestinian-controlled territory from which rockets are being launched and which is being targeted by Israeli airstrikes. Gaza is controlled by Hamas, a Muslim fundamentalist group that does not recognize Israel as a nation. Because Hamas's attacks through the years have targeted civilians, the US government and European Union consider it to be a terrorist organization, as does Israel. Hamas wants an Islamic country established in the region that now includes Israel. But decades of efforts to establish two countries in this area, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, have all failed. It has tremendous religious and historical significance to Jews and Muslims as well as Christians.
These rugged limestone hills in a rift valley east of the Mediterranean Sea have a rich and storied past, from the Bible right up to the present. Different peoples give it different names: Palestine, Judea and Samaria, or more simply, the West Bank, sitting, as it does, on the western side of the Jordan River. Nearly 3 million people live here, about 2.5 million Palestinians, and more than 400,000 Jewish settlers. It's not large, just twice the size of Rhode Island or Luxembourg, but it has been a central part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. June 1967 is a key month. That's when Israel, convinced it faced imminent invasion from its Arab neighbors, launched a series of preemptive strikes. In the short 6-day war that followed, Israel captured land from Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, from which it took the West Bank and East Jerusalem. When the United Nations Security Council convened a few months later, it declared the West Bank, like all the conquered lands, occupied territory. The Israeli army was ordered to withdraw. But there was little inclination to do so. Not only did the land provide Israel with a greatly enhanced sense of security along its eastern flank, it also meant access to holy sites with which the West Bank is richly endowed. In Hebron stands the Cave of the Patriarchs, where Abraham is buried. In Bethlehem, there's Rachel's tomb. Further north, in Nablus, is the tomb of Joseph. These sites, and many more, are holy to Jews, as well as to Christians and Muslims. In control of the West Bank, Israel began building homes for Jewish settlers, which became towns with schools, medical centers, even a university. The population of the settlements grew from 10,000 in 1979 to 100,000 by 1992
to over 440,000 in 2019.
All protected and supported by Israeli soldiers, as well as concrete, barbed wire, and checkpoints. Tensions with the Palestinian population, who felt they were being driven from the land and subjugated, have many times boiled over, producing indelible images still associated with the region: the rock-throwing youth, the carnage of a suicide attack, the devastating power of tanks and attack helicopters. But there have also been attempts at peace and resolution, and the focus has generally been on the same formula: 2 states for 2 peoples. The United Nations tried it first in 1947, a partition of the land held by Britain for 3 decades into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The plan fell apart, rejected by Arab powers. The high point of peace efforts came in the 1990s. As part of a negotiated agreement, the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas. It was an arrangement only ever meant to be temporary, bridging the way to the establishment of a state of Palestine, also including Gaza and parts of Jerusalem, living side by side with the state of Israel. But it never happened. Legally, little has changed. Most of the international community continues to describe all of the West Bank as occupied territory and says Israel's settlements are illegal. Israel disputes that, saying its rights to the land stretch back to biblical times, and the status of the land was unclear when Jordan had it before 1967. Palestinians also lay historical and religious claim to the land, where they still hope, one day, to build their state. The reality is that diplomacy has been in limbo for years. Negotiations, a peace process, seem like ideas from another era.
10-second trivia. Longhorn, Olympic, and Pony Express are all the names of what? National historic trails, oil pipelines, railroad companies, or cryptocurrency? These are all the names of oil pipelines like the Colonial Pipeline we've been reporting on. Less than a week after it was hit by a cyberattack on its computer systems, the Colonial Pipeline is up and running again. The company's main supply lines were restarted on Wednesday night, but fuel flows through these pipes slowly at 5 miles per hour, so it could still be days before southeastern gas stations have fuel to sell. As of Thursday morning, most gas stations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia were dry. The fuel tracking app GasBuddy also reported significant outages from Tennessee to Maryland. Besides the slow flow of fuel, there's a shortage of qualified truck drivers for gas deliveries, so that's not helping things. The computer hack on Colonial Pipeline was carried out using ransomware. It typically steals or locks up a business's important information until a ransom is paid to get it back. We had conflicting reports on whether Colonial paid the ransom. By Thursday morning, a source had told CNN that the company and U.S. government officials were able to get back the most important info that was stolen without paying the hackers. But Thursday afternoon, sources told the Bloomberg media company that Colonial paid the hackers nearly $5 million to get its files back. On Wednesday, President Joe Biden had signed an executive order that requires better cybersecurity on software sold to the government. But his administration says a lot more work is needed to prevent hacks like this one on Colonial Pipeline. A new electric vehicle concept is making waves because it would fly right above them. This is what a company named Regent calls a ground effect vehicle. It's a plane that would fly very close to the water, making it more efficient. Of course, there'd be less margin for error that close to the surface at 180 miles per hour. Other companies are working on concepts like this. Regent hopes to get its off the ground, or water, by 2025. A seaplane that is plain to see would be an oversea adventure. Wave hopping without stopping could be a popping business venture. Still, the service could make nervous those who fear they'd scratch the surface. Shaking loose a new spruce goose on sea or sky could ground its purpose. Evanston High is pretty fly. Want to give a shout out to our viewers in Evanston, Wyoming. YouTube is the place to go to request a shout out for your school. Just a heads up, our last show of the spring season airs 2 weeks from today on Friday, May 28th. I'm Carl Azus for CNN.